Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we are starting on a new series of videos about working with clients and what the actual process in real life in the illustration industry, what the process of working with clients is like from beginning to end. So I'm going to do several of these videos focusing on different industries. This first one is going to focus on editorial, so work for magazines and newspapers, different sorts of publications. So we are going to dive right into the first phase, which I am calling the groundwork phase. And for me, the beginning of the groundwork phase is usually when the client reaches out to me by email. It's almost always by email. Occasionally it might be on some sort of social media platform. I'm going to show you guys an example of an actual intro email that I had from a recent editorial client. All of the details have been scrubbed, so there's not going to be any name, the name of the client, the name of the art director, that will all be removed from the email, but you'll get to see the content of the email and as well as my response to it. So here it is, and you can see that they open up by saying, "Hi Kendyll, hope this email finds you well. I love the work you did for our recent issue. Your work is really beautiful. I was wondering if you'd be able to take on 3 spots in a portrait for our upcoming issue. I'd need sketches by Monday, April 29th and finals by Monday, May 6th. We usually pay $200 a spot. Let me know if this is doable for you and I'll send over the info ASAP. Thanks so much." So I would say this is a pretty standard to maybe even a little bit above average, better than average intro email. The opening line, just sort of saying, hey, how they found you, what they like about your work, that's pretty standard. What makes this email really nice is that they already say right up front what they're looking for. They want 3 spots and a portrait, and they say the budget that they have and the timeline. So those are like 3 big important things that if they hadn't been included in this email, I would have had to go back and figure out what those were before I could think seriously about taking the project on. So here's my reply. "Hello, art director. Thanks so much for reaching out and for your kind words about my work. I was thrilled to have the opportunity to work with the magazine on the last issue, and I'd love to work with you on this assignment. I could have sketches by end of day Monday, provided I receive all the references and the brief by this evening. That said, my project schedule is already quite full next week. Do you have any flexibility on the due date for finals? As for budget, I generally start at $250 for spots and $400 for portraits. Would you be able to make that work? Looking forward to hearing more. Thanks very much, Kendyll." Some important elements here. I mentioned that I can have the sketches by end of day Monday as they've requested, as long as I receive all the references and the brief by that evening. So if I were to have just said, sure thing, I can have all of that done by end of day Monday, but not said when I need all of the references, then they might have not gotten me the references until like Monday morning or something, and that wouldn't have given me enough time to work on it. So I agree to their timeline, but I stipulate when I need the materials by in order to get started and have it finished by that deadline. And then I went ahead and asked if there was any other flexibility in the project schedule, since my plate was already pretty full in the coming week. And then I also raised the issue of budget, since their budget was $200 per each of these 4 illustrations, and one of them was a portrait, which is always more work, more complex, they take more time. So I went ahead and asked whether there was more money in the budget, whether we could increase the budget. And you can see if you look at the time, I've replied to this email within a couple of hours. So especially for editorial clients, having that really snappy, timely communication in the beginning is always really appreciated. They agreed right away to my budget terms, which is great. Then in terms of the schedule, that turned out to actually be kind of the sticking point in this project, where they really wanted it by a certain date, and that date was really just pretty challenging, not very doable for me. But basically we came to an agreement, and within 24 hours, everything was all squared away, and they were sending me the references, and I was getting ready to go ahead and jump in on the project. So I would say that is pretty typical turnaround time in terms of the communication, the initial communication with a client for an editorial project, somewhere between 4 to 6 or 7 emails altogether. The terms will get decided within that chain of communication. So the first is the scope of the project, and that can really vary widely from client to client. It could be anywhere from 1 little tiny spot illustration to 10 spot illustrations. And usually, in my experience of working with editorial, they don't need the work to be quite as large. They're usually just presenting it in a magazine or in a newspaper, so the size that's going to be printed at isn't massive. So they're typically okay with things being a bit smaller in size, maybe even a little bit less detailed than say a client for packaging or advertising might be. The type of direction, so the type of art direction that you'll receive from the art director, how specific they're going to be in what they tell you and how they dictate the process, basically like how much they're going to micromanage you or not. With editorial clients, the direction in my experience is usually pretty minimal, maybe 1 to 3 sentences per subject. So if you're just doing one subject, one illustration, it might just be a couple of sentences that describe what they want that illustration to be. Maybe they'll attach a couple of photos to the email. All right, timeline for editorial clients is usually pretty quick. So this example communication that you saw with this actual client of mine, it was quick for me, and I was trying to push it out mainly because I already had a fully booked slate of client work. But overall, that was actually a great timeline for editorial. With editorial, you can have timelines that are as quick as like 24 or 48 hours, depending on the client. I would say they are, in my experience, never much longer than 10 days, and that would be a very generous timeline for an editorial project. So in this industry, in editorial, you do have to be able to work quickly and be okay with working under pressure. The budget, that varies a lot depending on the publication, the complexity of the illustration, the experience of the illustrator, the timeline. There are all of those factors that play into it. I would say, generally speaking, for spot illustrations, on the low end, you would find maybe like a 175, 150, 175, which would be pretty low. I would not take on any work at that rate, but it does get offered, and there are clients that have that set as a budget. And then it would range all the way up to like 500, which would definitely be on the higher end for spot illustrations. So there's a huge range. I typically will ask for something in the $250 to $300 range. $250 would be the lower end for me. $300 or $350 would be the higher end. And then if it's something like a portrait, it would be, closer to $400 or even $450, depending on how much of the figure they want included. And a full page illustration could be anywhere from $800 to $2,500, depending again on those factors that I mentioned: the complexity of the illustration, the size of the client, the market for this particular publication. All of those factors will influence the pricing. I am going to recommend a resource that I talk about all the time, and that is the Graphic Artists Guild Handbook for Pricing and Ethical Guidelines. And that is what I base pretty much all of my pricing on, as well as my own experience. But it's been a huge help and a contributor for me in being able to come up with what are fair industry standard market rates. So I will have a link to that book in the description. Continuing on with Groundwork here, references, whether they're supplied or self-sourced. For the most part, editorial clients do have some sort of reference that they come to you with, some sort of image that they show you to indicate what they're looking for. All right, 2 more points in the Groundwork section. First is payment schedule. So generally with editorial clients, they pay in full at the end of the project. So, or rather, you submit an invoice for full payment at the end of the project. If you have watched my channel and you've watched my illustration business videos before, you know that I really strongly recommend getting deposits whenever possible. But in this instance, in this field, it's good to know that it's pretty standard to not get a deposit. So that ties into the next point, which is the contract. And if you're not getting a deposit, it's even more important to have a really solid contract that stipulates that they only have the rights to use your work if they have paid you. So generally with larger clients, they will have a contract, as well as some other forms, other paperwork that you'll have to fill out. But you can still, sometimes they will still be willing to sign your contract, or if it's a smaller publication, they may want you to go ahead and just send them your own contract. Regardless of which route you take, if a client supplies you the contract, make sure you read it really carefully and check to ensure that it has those important elements, those important things that you want to have in every illustration contract. We're not going to go over those in this video, but I have already made a video about that, which will be up on the screen and will be linked in the video as well. So all of those important terms that you want to be sure to include in a client contract. All right, moving on to phase 2, the sketches, or sort sort of initial development phase. This phase includes you coming up with the ideas, you presenting the sketches, and incorporating receiving client feedback and incorporating client feedback on those ideas. All right, so first up, number of sketches. This can vary a lot depending on the style of illustration you do. And typically, if it's an editorial client, I will do one sketch if it's a spot illustration. And if it's a larger illustration that has multiple components that could be presented in a few different ways, I'll do, depending on the situation, I'll do anywhere from like 1 to 3 different sketches. For size and level of detail, that varies again. It really depends on how the illustration is going to be used. If it's a spot illustration, I create it smaller. If it's going to be a big illustration, somewhere big on the page or big on the website, I create it larger. In terms of how much detail they have, sketches don't usually have a ton of detail, at least for me. They're typically just very simple pencil sketches. Their entire purpose in life is to communicate what the composition is to the client. So I don't really need them to be really fancy or really detailed. They just need to show where the different components are going to be, how the composition is going to look, so that the client can drop it into the page layout and just get a sense for it and make sure it's going to work. So color or no color. Sketches usually do not have color. As I mentioned, they're usually just pencil line sketches for editorial clients. All right, and number and scope of revisions. So typically for editorial clients, I do 2 revisions total. 1 revision will be at this phase, at the sketch phase. And at the sketch phase, I allow for pretty much anything that the client wants to change. Anything that involves changing the composition or the layout or the elements themselves in the sketch at the sketch stage revision, I will accommodate for that. The only things I won't do are any major additions of new subjects. So if they came to me and they said, all right, we want an illustration of a bagel, and we agreed on a price, I would change lots about the bagel itself, maybe even turning it into a different kind of bagel. But if they were to come back at the revision phase of the sketches and say, oh, can you also include, a hand and have it bringing the bagel up to a mouth and a person taking a bite, at that point, I would say that we would need to potentially revisit the pricing for that illustration, because the pricing was based on just, being a bagel with cream cheese, and including some significant new elements would increase the complexity and therefore the price. And you also need to make that clear to the client up front, rather than just billing them for extra at the end that's beyond what you agreed upon in terms of the budget. So once they send me that feedback, once I get the feedback, I will incorporate it. I will change the sketch according to whatever the client has asked for. If we have a good timeline, or if the client has asked for it, I will then show them the sketch just to be 100% sure that works, that they're on board with the way that it's been set up. But if the timeline is really tight, or if they haven't requested it, sometimes I'll just incorporate the feedback and then move right on to the finals. So that's something you kind of have to figure out on a project by project basis as well. So the length of this phase, the length of the sketch phase, this is usually, aside from the initial groundwork, this is usually the shortest phase of the process. Could be anywhere from just 12 hours to maybe up to 72 hours. In my experience, this is usually where there's the least amount of communication. I typically will just send an email when I'm getting started, and then I'll send another email when I'm done with the sketches and have presented the sketches, and then there'll be another email or 2 from the client when they receive the sketches and give the feedback. Okay, so moving on to phase 3, which is the creation of the final artwork. So the size, the level of detail, all of that will just be, for me, it's just exactly the same as what it was in the sketches. So if I was working at a 4x6, I'll be working at a 4x6 for the final. As for the number and scope of revisions, I mentioned that I do 2 total for editorial clients usually. So the first revision would have already been taken care of in the sketch phase. The second revision that I include is at the final phase. So after I have created the final work, fully rendered it, it's all in color, it's all done, I scan it in, I send it to the client, and then they have one last opportunity to request small changes. These would typically be limited only to things like tweaking the color, maybe saturation, things that could be done digitally, or potentially a little bit of surface texture, like adding more highlights or adding more shadows or smoothing a certain area out. Those would all be things that would be included in this revision, in this phase of revisions. So that is a personal decision. There's nothing that's like across the board expected, but I would say it's fairly standard standard to have at least 2 opportunities for revision, one at the sketch and one after you've presented the final for any small tweaks. All right, the length of this phase, generally you get 2 to 5 days from the time you get the feedback from the client and the sketch is revised. You have a few days, 2 to 5 days to complete the final illustrations. All right, communication during this phase, again, somewhere around 3 to 4 emails total probably. I'll send one once I'm confirming that I've gotten the revisions, made the revisions, and go start on color. Then I send another one letting them know that the color is done and presenting the final illustrations. So yeah, they'll either reply and say, looks great, please send a link to the high-res versions and your invoice, or they might say, looks good, but can we change this or that? In which case I would have to reply back and say yes, and then go ahead and make the change and send over the new version. So fairly minimal communication once again at this point, just really what is necessary to go back and forth and get things taken care of. All right, phase 4, approval and delivery. So at this phase, you've already completed the work, the client has already approved it. The only thing left to do is to prep the final files for delivery. So another common question I get is whether clients get the actual illustrations or just the digital files. And that depends on your work, that depends on the industry. But in my experience with the editorial industry and the editorial market, clients really only ever are requiring the digital files. So to prep that file, the standard things that I do are to completely remove the background. So not just to tone down the noise or amp up the white, but I actually clear cut the background so the illustration is just isolated on a clear background by itself. I'll do some sort of small color tweaks to make sure it looks like it does in real life. I do not do the RGB to CMYK conversion. Plenty of illustrators do. The reason I don't is because a lot of, especially larger publications, actually have someone either on staff or someone that they contract with who specifically specializes in RGB to CMYK conversion. All right, and as for the file type and delivery method, we've already said it's going to be a digital file. Usually for editorial clients, my editorial clients usually just want a JPEG. They want a high quality JPEG. Occasionally, if they want the clear background, I'll export a TIFF, but either it's a high quality JPEG or a TIFF. I always make sure to format the illustration specifically for their size requirements. And then also on that note, if I've made something at 4x6, but they're only going to be printing it like at roughly 2x3, I don't want to give them the 4x6 because they didn't pay for a 4x6. So I want to make sure that they are limited to the scope and the size of the illustration that they actually paid for. As for delivery method, if it is only a couple of small spot illustrations, I will usually just attach those to the body of an email. They're not typically too large. If it's several spot illustrations or a spot illustration and a large illustration, I'll put together a folder in Dropbox with the finals and just send the client a link to the Dropbox folder. You can use a free Dropbox account for that. I have a paid Dropbox account because I need it. But if you're just getting started or you haven't done a ton of this yet, a free Dropbox account will be more than enough space to do that. All right, so the final phase, phase 5, this is last sort of wrap up a communication with the client and actually getting paid. So once you have delivered your files, you can send the invoice. And some people will send the invoice in the same file, in the same email that they send the high-res finals in. I prefer to have it in a separate email that actually has the word invoice and the invoice number in the subject line of the email. It just makes it really clear. It makes it harder for that to get kind of lost in the shuffle among the other stuff. So pretty much as soon as I send, or when I'm sending the final delivery email, I'll include a line at the end that says my invoice will be along shortly. And then within a couple of minutes, or maybe if I'm not doing any admin that day, maybe the next day, I will send along the invoice. But I always let the client know when the invoice is going to be coming, and then just having the word invoice and your invoice number in the title just makes it easier for everybody to keep track of. Again, depending on the publication, the size of the publication, you might be sending your invoice directly to the art director that you worked with, or you might be sending it to someone in accounting or some other sort of assistant person, some kind of liaison go-between person person. Really, it can depend on the publication. So my advice there is just to pay attention to what their protocol is. And if you don't know, that's another thing you can mention when you send the final email. You can just ask the art director, please let me know who I should direct my invoice to, or whether there's any specific protocol I should follow in terms of titling the invoice. Sometimes they want you to put your name on the invoice, for example. So paying attention to the procedure and trying to do it the way that the organization, the company wants it done, that will just speed things along in terms of receiving your payment quicker. All right, last point, how long does it take to receive payment? So in my experience, it can be anywhere from a week to, I think the longest terms I've had were 90 days. And actually, those weren't even the terms. I think the terms were 45 days, but the client was late. And that is a reality, unfortunately. It's across many different industries. In my experience, it tends to happen quite a lot with editorial, just especially if you're working with a larger client. So you do tend to have to wait a little bit longer, which is unfortunate, but I have never been completely stiffed by a magazine. They've always paid in the end. I can actually do a dedicated video about that if you guys want, like a video about chasing down invoices and some tactics that I use to make sure that I get paid. If you want to hear more about that, or you want to have a dedicated conversation about that, let me know in the comments and we can make it happen. Okay, so that is it for this video on working with editorial clients from beginning to end. I hope it was helpful. I hope you liked the video. As I said, I'm planning on doing a series of these. So there is another one in the works already that's going to be on packaging. And yeah, if you like this kind of video, if you'd like to see more of them about different industries, there are certainly some other industries I could do as well. And I'm even open to potentially reaching out to other illustrators who work in different industries to see if they would be willing to do one of these. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on that, as well as any follow-up questions that you have. I probably will do just a general Q&A on working with clients once these first couple of videos have come out. So you can put those in the comments as well. And yes, thank you to you for watching this video. If you subscribed, thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And thank you to Meg for the amazing editing. Thank you to my patrons, especially for supporting this channel and making it possible for me to put weekly videos like this out into the world for free for you guys. I love doing it. It's a huge privilege. And yeah, I just can't thank my patrons enough for making that possible. So thank you. Hope everybody has a great week, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.